There is a particular kind of silence that follows a life lived entirely at full volume. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of completion, the moment after the last note has been played, when the air still holds the shape of the sound that was just inside it, and the world tries to remember how to breathe without the music filling every available space. Little Richard knew that silence was coming. He had known it for years, and in the final chapter of his extraordinary, uncontainable, gloriously complicated life, he did something that surprised even the people who thought they knew him completely. He talked about it, openly, without performance, without the costume or the pompadour or the magnificent theatrical armor that had protected and defined him for 7 decades. He sat in chairs and looked at cameras and spoke about what it felt like to be at the end, not with fear, not with bitterness, but with the particular kind of clarity that arrives only when a person has truly nothing left to prove. What he said in those final years was more honest than almost anything he had ever recorded, and what he revealed about the music, about the God he had spent his entire life running toward and away from, about the legacy he was leaving behind, and about the specific, private cost of being the person who cracks the world open so that everyone else can walk through, is a story that deserves to be told in full. This is not a story about death. It is a story about what a life looked like when the man who had lived it finally turned around and allowed himself to see it clearly. And what little Richard saw in those last quiet years was something that neither his fiercest critics nor his most devoted admirers had ever quite understood about him. He was not afraid, he was grateful. And the gratitude, after everything, after the gospel and the rock and roll, and the departures and the returns and the decades of spiritual conflict, and the industry's thefts and the world's incomplete understanding of who he actually was, the gratitude was the most radical thing he had ever expressed. But to understand what he was grateful for, you have to understand what it cost him to get there. Richard Wayne Penniman had been performing since before most people could remember not performing. He had stood on street corners in Macon, Georgia as a child and demanded attention from passersby who had no particular reason to give it. He had sung in Pentecostal churches where the Spirit moved through bodies like electricity through wire. He had played piano in clubs that the church considered fallen territory, absorbing every technique and every truth that the rhythm and blues world had to offer. He had screamed into microphones in New Orleans recording studios and produced sounds that the world had not previously heard and did not know it had been waiting for. By the time Tutti Frutti was released in 1955, Little Richard was 22 years old and already a veteran of a decade of grinding, unglamorous, essential preparation. The hit did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from everywhere, from every church pew and every club stage and every medicine show and every bowling alley and every roadhouse where he had learned, note by note and night by night, what it meant to hold a room. What followed Tutti Frutti was one of the most concentrated periods of creative impact in the history of popular music. In the space of roughly 3 years, 1955 through 1958, Little Richard produced a body of recordings that would permanently alter the cultural landscape. Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Ready Teddy, Good Golly Miss Molly, Lucille, Jenny, Keep A, Knockin'. Each song hit the culture with the force of something that had been building pressure for a very long time and had finally found its release point. The performances were even more extraordinary than the recordings. Little Richard on stage was not a performance in the conventional sense. It was an event, an experience, something that audiences described afterward in language that bordered on the theological. He stood on the piano. He kicked the stool aside. He ran into the crowd. He played with his elbow and his foot and his nose and any other body part that happened to make contact with the keys. He screamed when screaming was the only honest response to the music underneath him. He gave every single person in every single room the specific feeling that they were watching something that had never happened before and might never happen again. He was right. It had never happened before, not exactly like that, not with that combination of gospel ecstasy and secular freedom and theatrical excess and genuine, unguarded human vulnerability all moving through one body at the same time. But behind the spectacle, the conflict that had always been there continued its work. The gospel boy and the rock and roll tornado were the same person, inseparably fused, drawing energy from the same source, but the fusion was not peaceful, it was combustive. And in 1957, the combustion reached a point that demanded resolution. He walked away from rock and roll. He threw his jewelry into the Hunter River in Australia. He enrolled in theology school. He chose the gospel boy over the devil's pianist as completely as he knew how. But he came back, as he always came back, because the alternative was a silence of the wrong kind, not the silence of completion, but the silence of suppression. And Little Richard had never been built for suppression. What followed were decades of movement between worlds, gospel and secular faith and performance, the pulpit and the stage, that looked from the outside like inconsistency, but felt from the inside like the only honest response to being the specific person he was. He could not choose between his faith and his music because both were genuine, both were him. And the refusal to falsify either one, even at the cost of appearing contradictory to those watching from a distance, was one of the most authentically human things he ever did. Through the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s he performed, he recorded, he appeared on television and in films. He accepted Lifetime Achievement Awards and Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions with speeches that were simultaneously hilarious and heartbreaking. Humble and outrageously self-aware, he claimed credit where credit was due, loudly, repeatedly, with a persistence that some found excessive and that was, in fact, entirely justified. He told anyone who would listen that he had invented rock and roll, that Elvis had learned from him, that the Beatles had built their early identity on his foundation, that Jimi Hendrix had watched him night after night from the wings before finding his own seismic voice. He was not wrong. He was not boasting. He was simply telling the truth in a world that had a long and well-documented habit of redistributing the truths of black artists into the mouths of others. But something was changing, quietly, gradually, the way the light changes in late afternoon. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but steadily, until you look up and realize the quality of everything around you has shifted. Little Richard was getting older, and with age came a reckoning that no amount of performance could postpone indefinitely. The physical changes arrived with the particular cruelty that time reserves for people whose bodies have been the primary instrument of their art. A hip replacement. Then another. Falls that would have been minor inconveniences for a younger man became significant events. The voice, that extraordinary, impossible voice that had occupied ranges and produced textures that most singers could not approach, began to show its age in small ways that Richard himself noticed long before anyone else did. He reduced his touring schedule, then he reduced it further. The man who had once performed hundreds of shows a year was now performing dozens, then fewer than that. Each concert became more deliberate, more considered, not because the fire was gone, but because fire at 80 requires a different relationship with fuel than fire at 22. He sat for interviews in his later years with a quality of presence that was different from anything he had offered publicly before. The performance was still there. Richard could not entirely turn off the performer any more than he could turn off the gospel singer or the theology student or the frightened boy from Macon. But it was quieter now, placed alongside something else, something reflective and unguarded and genuinely humble in a way that had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with honest accounting. He talked about his mother, about Leva Mae Penniman, the steady center of a crowded household, whose faith had been the original architecture of everything he had built on top of it. He spoke about her with a tenderness that suggested that no amount of fame or achievement had ever fully displaced the boy who had wanted, above all things, to make her proud. He talked about the artists he had influenced, but differently than he had in his more combative years. Less as a claim of ownership and more as an expression of genuine wonder. That the sounds he had made in a New Orleans recording studio in 1955 had traveled outward in so many directions, had entered so many bodies and changed so many minds, had produced so many different creative responses. This still struck him in his 80s as something close to miraculous. He talked about God. He always talked about God. But in his final years, the conversation with God that had been the central drama of his interior life, the push and pull, the departure and return, the guilt and the release and the guilt again, seemed to have arrived at something quieter. Not resolution exactly. Richard was too honest for the kind of resolution that papers over genuine complexity. But something like acceptance. The acceptance of a man who had lived long enough to understand that the questions he had been asking his whole life were not going to receive clean answers, and that the asking itself had been the point. The music gave people a way to feel things they could not otherwise access. That was what he said in different words in different interviews across the final years. The music was a door. He had been the one who had found it and broken it open and stood in the doorway for decades, letting people through. And if the doorway was sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes transgressive, sometimes theologically complicated, well, doors to important places usually were, but what the music had given him? That was the question he returned to most often in those quiet conversations. What had it given him, the man who had made it? He answered it differently at different times. Sometimes he said it had given him everything. Sometimes he said it had given him more than he deserved. Sometimes in more unguarded moments, he admitted that it had given him things and taken things, in proportions that he was still working out. It had given him visibility in a world designed to make people like him invisible. It had given him a language for feelings that had no other adequate expression. It had given him connection, the specific, irreplaceable connection that happens between a performer and an audience when something true passes between them, When the person on stage and the people watching simultaneously recognize something in each other that they have never been able to articulate alone. It had taken from him too. The industry had taken money, credit, ownership, recognition that arrived decades late if it arrived at all. The spiritual conflict had taken years of genuine anguish, departures from the music he loved, the ongoing impossibility of being fully at peace in either the church or the club. The performance itself had taken the relentless physical and emotional expenditure of giving everything, night after night, to rooms full of strangers, until the instrument of the body that had made it all possible began to show the inevitable signs of that expenditure. He had given the world something enormous, and the world had given him back something real, and something insufficient, and something that could not be fully quantified in either direction. He knew this. He said it, in his way, and he said it without bitterness, which was the remarkable thing, which was, in the end, perhaps the most extraordinary performance of his entire career. The last years were marked by a gentleness that people who had known him only through his recordings or his reputation found surprising. The volcanic energy was still there when he needed it. Richard never entirely lost access to the thing that had made him Little Richard, but it was surrounded now by a quietude that had been earned rather than adopted. The quietude of a man who had fought his fights and made his peace, not with the world's incomplete understanding of him, but with his own complicated understanding of himself. He received visitors. He gave interviews. He watched younger artists perform and spoke about them with genuine warmth, without the edge of competitive awareness that had sometimes characterized his commentary in earlier decades. He prayed. He listened to music, not just his own but all kinds, the full range of what had poured through the door he had helped open. He ate food he enjoyed. He laughed, which had always been one of his great gifts, and which remained fully intact when almost everything else had been touched by time. He spoke about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, which had come in 1986, as one of the moments that had felt most like genuine acknowledgement. Not the award itself exactly, but the occasion it created, the gathering of people who understood what the music had meant and were willing to say so formally, in a room, with cameras recording it for history. He had not always been certain that history would remember to be fair to him. The induction was evidence that it might try. He spoke about the young artists who had sought him out over the years, who had come to him not as tourists visiting a landmark, but as students visiting a teacher, genuinely hungry to understand where their own musical instincts had come from, and who had first given those instincts permission to exist. These visits meant more to him than he usually admitted publicly. To be sought out by people whose work he respected, to have the chain of influence acknowledged not just in the abstract but in the specific, human form of one artist traveling to sit across from another and say, "You made this possible." This was a form of recognition that went deeper than any award. He spoke about Macon. He returned there in his imagination frequently in those final years, the way people return in age to the places that formed them. The church, the household. The street corner where he had first understood that a voice could stop strangers in their tracks. He had traveled the entire world and played for every conceivable kind of audience and accumulated a legacy that stretched across genres and generations and continents. And the coordinates from which all of that had departed were a small city in Georgia, where a boy had sat in a church pew and heard the gospel for the first time and felt something ignite inside him that would never entirely go out. He spoke about his mother. He spoke about his mother a great deal, and he spoke, in quiet, careful, unperformed words, about what he hoped he had given to the people who had listened to his music across all those decades. Not the specific thing they might name if asked, not the hits or the performances or the cultural impact, but the underlying thing, the thing that the music had always been about underneath the costumes and the spectacle and the theological drama. Permission, he said. In one form or another, in one interview or another across the final years. He hoped he had given people permission. Permission to be loud when the world told them to be quiet. Permission to be visible when the world preferred them invisible. Permission to be all of themselves simultaneously, the sacred and the profane, the frightened and the free, the child from the church and the person who had taken the church's fire and carried it somewhere new. Permission to refuse to shrink. That was what he had needed as a boy in Macon, and that was what the music had given him eventually, imperfectly, at great cost. And if it had traveled outward from him into other people, if something in the way he had stood at a piano and refused to be contained had given even one other person the courage to be the full version of themselves, then the accounting, however complicated, came out right. Richard Wayne Penniman died on May 9, 2020 at his home in Tullahoma, Tennessee. He was 87 years old. The cause of death was bone cancer, a diagnosis that had been kept largely private, consistent with a man who had always understood the difference between performing for an audience and simply living his life. The tributes came from everywhere, from musicians who had been directly influenced by him, Artists who had built careers on the foundation he had laid and who understood, with full clarity, what they owed. From fans who had been listening since 1955 and who had grown old alongside the music, finding in it different meanings at different stages of their lives. From cultural critics and historians who had spent careers trying to articulate precisely what it was that little Richard had done and why it mattered, and were grateful now for the chance to say it one final time. But the tribute that would have meant most to Richard himself was the one that could not be given in words or awards or public statements. It was the quieter tribute, the one that happens every time someone puts on a record and hears that opening scream and feels something unlock in their chest. Every time a young musician learns a Little Richard song and discovers in the learning that the song is teaching them something about what music is for that they could not have learned any other way. Every time a person who has been told to be smaller or quieter or more manageable hears Tutti Frutti or Good Golly Miss Molly and finds in the 3 minutes of its playing a temporary but genuine permission to be exactly the size they actually are. That is the legacy. Not the chart positions or the Hall of Fame plaque or the list of artists he influenced. The legacy is the permission, still active, still traveling, still reaching people who need it. Little Richard gave the world a great many things across his 87 years. He gave it the sound of rock and roll. He gave it the spectacle of performance taken to its absolute limit. He gave it the example of a person who contained profound contradictions and refused to resolve them cheaply. He gave it the proof that the sacred and the profane were not opposites but relatives, drawn from the same place, answering the same need, carrying the same human longing toward the same horizon. And in the end, in those quiet final years when the music had slowed and the voice had softened and the piano stool no longer went flying across the stage, he gave it one more thing. He gave it honesty. The specific, unperformed, completely human honesty of a man looking back at a life lived at full volume and finding it, with all its complications and costs and unresolved questions, genuinely worth having lived. The last note rang out, the silence came. And in the silence, as in all the silences that had ever followed his performances, the music was still there, still holding its shape in the air, still reaching, still giving permission. He had worried across decades of spiritual conflict, whether what he had done with his gifts had been acceptable in the eyes of God, whether the gospel he had taken out of the church and put into the clubs had honored or dishonored the source it came from, whether the boy who had sat in those Macon pews and felt the Spirit move through the congregation had grown into someone that congregation would recognize or disown. In his final years, the worry seemed to have quieted, not because the questions had been answered, but because he had lived long enough to see what the music had done in the world, the specific, irreplaceable, unmistakable good it had done, and to understand that goodness as an answer of a different kind. The music had moved people. It had unlocked something in them. It had given them, for 3 minutes at a time, across 7 decades, the feeling that the life inside them was larger than the container the world had built for it. That feeling, that specific, essential, sacred feeling, was the same feeling that had moved through those Macon church walls when the gospel singers opened their mouths and let the Spirit out. He had not taken the gospel out of the church. He had taken it further in, into every room where people gathered and needed to feel something larger than themselves, into every body that had been told it was too loud, too wild, too much, into every heart that had been carrying a sound it could not quite get out until it heard Little Richard get it out first. The gospel boy, the devil's pianist, the architect of rock and roll, the man who gave the world permission to be impossible to ignore. He sat at the piano one last time. He placed his hands on the keys. And what came through them, quiet now, unhurried, no stool to kick across the stage, no crowd to pull into the palm of his hand, was the same thing that had always come through them. The truth, loud as a scream, gentle as a prayer, and real,